This right here is the PowKiddy RGB10Max3 Pro, a recently released emulation handheld device that initially looks pretty sleek and even features some reasonable specs too. However, it also comes with some unfortunate caveats that might end up being deal breakers, so let's talk about it. First impressions with this device were a mixed bag. Going purely off of looks, I actually quite like the minimal design here. It's about as basic as you could get, featuring a D-pad on the top left, the standard Nintendo action buttons on the right, a pair of analog sticks below those which feel pretty much identical to Switch Joy-Con sticks, and a set back into the shell of the device to avoid it snagging while in your pocket or bag, stereo speakers on the left and right below those, and then your function buttons, volume control and start and select on the very bottom of the device. This is pretty much the absolute perfect layout for this kind of device. Most of the stuff you'll be playing will only require a D-pad rather than analog controls, so I appreciate that the D-pad has pride of place. The buttons on the bottom row are quite clicky and cheap feeling, but I don't mind this too much considering you're not going to be pressing these much outside of menu navigation. The actual face buttons though are really good, having a much softer touch to them but still giving you a bit of a click when fully pressed for that satisfying feedback. The D-pad is great too, it's not loosely set in the frame, which is a pet peeve of mine, and like the face buttons, it's quite soft, which I personally like. On the top we've got shoulder buttons, which unfortunately are in line rather than being stacked. There's also the power button, a slot for the micro SD card, a charging port, headphone jack, port for peripherals, and a mini HDMI output too. You've got basically everything you could want here, even things that some other handhelds skimp out on like the HDMI output, which is nice to see included. The issues I have with the build of the device mostly come down to how cheap the body of it feels. It's a plastic shell, which is fine, but it's also insanely light too, which ends up making it lack that premium feel that some other handhelds in a similar price range have. Speaking of price, this normally costs $135 from the official site, although it is currently on sale and seemingly has always been on sale since release, so I guess the real price is $115 and that's with no micro SD card. If you get the 128GB SD card, the price is raised to $135 for its sale price. Now consider you can get something like the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus for $149 and it puts the RGB10Max3 Pro in a bit of an awkward price point considering that the Pocket 3 Plus CPU is significantly more powerful and offers much greater utility with a higher resolution screen and running Android rather than Linux like we see with the RGB10Max3 Pro. It's kind of in a situation where it's so similar to other devices that there's not a lot to make it all that appealing. But let's not count this out just yet. Maybe the experience of actually using it and playing games on it is just that streamlined that it makes up for the kinda high price tag. So let's talk specs for a moment. The PowKiddy RGB10Max3 Pro features an Amlogic A311D CPU, 2GB of RAM, a 5-inch IPS screen at 854x480 resolution, and a 4000 mAh battery. This all sounds pretty good, but what does it actually mean? Well, if you're looking for a first handheld that doesn't require a lot of work to get up and running, this seems like a pretty good choice. I got it from the official PowKiddy website with an 128GB SD card, and upon receiving it, the card was preloaded with thousands of games spanning multiple systems. You've got a selection of games ranging all the way from the Atari 2600 to the PS2, with almost every major system in between accounted for. The only problem with this, beyond the questionable legality of being provided with these ROMs, is that the actual libraries of these games can seem a bit random. For example, there's no Mario titles at all, which is speculated to be because they're trying to avoid Nintendo cracking down on them, but even beyond that, there's a grand total of 3 PS2 games installed on the card, which just seems pointless. At that point, you might as well just not have any. But then you've got some other libraries like the NES and the PS1, which are actually pretty good. so I guess your experience with this will vary depending on what systems you're looking to play. I would always recommend that you just customize your own library of ROMs. That way you know you've got everything on there that you're going to want to play, and you also know that you're not clogging up all of your storage with stuff that you're never going to touch. Just make sure that you obtain all of those ROMs legally. In terms of getting your games onto the system, it's as easy as taking the micro SD card, which is formatted to your device, plugging it into a PC using a micro SD card reader, and then literally dragging and dropping ROM files into the folders corresponding to the console before. Updating the device needs to be done in a similar way to this too, due to the fact that the RGB10Max3 Pro doesn't have any Wi-Fi capabilities. This was probably decided to keep the device as cheap as possible, but as I said earlier, it's not really that cheap. So I don't know if this was the best move, but whatever. The RGB10Max3 Pro now runs JelOS by default, which is a custom version of Linux designed for handheld devices. I know that when these were first shipping, some of them actually used the Retro Arena, which isn't the best looking OS, so I'm glad to see that they made the transition over to JelOS. Another issue that's been addressed is the screen tearing problem which this device had when it first released. This has been completely resolved, and I actually think that the screen looks great. It's a 5-inch IPS display with a resolution of 854 by 480, which makes it ideal for playing 5th generation consoles like PS1 and N64 at the native resolution. The viewing angles are really good here too, and I would say that the screen is potentially one of this device's greatest strengths due to its pretty big size and the clarity of the image. It does seem to pick up fingerprints and dust extremely easily though, so make sure you've got a cloth nearby to keep it clean. Going back to JelOS now though, I actually really like how this looks. Everything is organised and your games are automatically detected, which keeps things simple. You can quite easily access the JelOS settings menu and customise things to your needs. Something you'll probably want to do is mute the background audio, because it's always really annoying when an OS has music. But other than that, you can also hide particular game collections and generally tidy things up a bit if you want. But now let's get on to the good stuff. How do games actually run on this? Right off the bat, something I want to mention is that you know how I said it has a HDMI output, which is great because a lot of devices opt to not include that. Yeah, it doesn't work. It just straight up doesn't display an image if you plug it into a TV or monitor, and this is apparently something that previous PowKiddy devices have done too, like with the X55, where people ended up having to make custom firmware to get the output working after the device was released. But what world are we living in where there's a port on a device that doesn't function and we're basically told to wait for someone else to fix it? That's a shame. Ignoring that though, I had a generally really positive experience with this. Of course, any 8-bit or 16-bit games from the 3rd or 4th generation consoles are gonna play perfectly. The controls are automatically detected by each emulator, and it feels pretty much perfect with the layout of the buttons on the device. So far so good. The issues begin when you enter the 5th generation of consoles in the 32 and 64-bit era. The quality of emulation is great and everything was running with no frame rate drops, however, this is where the controls started to let the device down. Any game which requires the use of the R2 and L2 buttons are a bit of a pain due to how they're in line with the R1 and L1 buttons. However, because R2 and L2 are raised slightly, it does mean that things are as comfortable as they're gonna get, and it means you can press the trigger buttons without accidentally hitting the shoulder buttons at the same time. It's just not an ideal situation due to having your finger more curled over the top of the device than what you normally would. Another problem is that I found the analog sticks to be way too sensitive. This results in games feeling a lot looser than they're supposed to and can be an issue in games that require precise movement. It even affects games that don't require precision though, because you'll find yourself moving off to the side even when you're trying to move in a straight line. It just isn't ideal. Moving up to the 6th generation consoles is where we start encountering major problems with the quality of emulation. Dreamcast is perfect. If you're looking for a handheld Dreamcast emulator, then this could be the device for you. But going beyond that is where I started having issues. Now, I have seen people have more success using this device for these next consoles than what I had, but even so, because of the technical issues I experienced, I still can't really recommend this for GameCube or PS2. It's just a bit too rough for me, with certain games playing surprisingly well and others running so poorly that they're unplayable. Both with GameCube and PS2, the sort of experience you're gonna get out of this depends heavily on the game you're trying to play. Grand Theft Auto 3 on the PS2 played extremely well with a pretty rock-solid frame rate sitting around the 60 mark. But then playing Ratchet & Clank for the same system was an absolute nightmare, barely able to maintain even an inconsistent frame rate in the slightest. GameCube is a similar story, although I would say from what I tested it was a bit more consistent here, although nothing ran absolutely perfectly. Mario Kart Double Dash runs quite well. It's sitting comfortably in the high 50 mark with the occasional dip below that, but it's reasonably infrequent. Super Monkey Ball is also pretty good, but the problem is that the occasional dip just brings you out of the experience. Then there's games like Super Mario Sunshine, which was pretty much unplayable due to the fact that it kept crashing. For the games that actually work though, the occasional frame dip isn't absolutely game-breaking, but it's enough that I couldn't recommend this device for PS2 or GameCube emulation. What surprised me though is that DS and PSP emulation worked really well. The issue with DS is that the device doesn't feature a touchscreen, so you're kinda limited on what games you can play. But for the games that are suited to a traditional control setup, it's flawless. But the star of the show is definitely the PSP, which is genuinely good here, and because of the device's widescreen aspect ratio, it's actually really well suited to PSP emulation. I was playing stuff at 2x resolution and it was running perfectly. If there was a single thing I would highly recommend this device for, it would be if you're particularly passionate about PSP games. This is about as good as you're gonna get in this area without spending more on a more premium device. That's kinda where things end though. I've seen videos of people playing 3DS games and it looking really smooth, but I can't for the life of me get anything running at an acceptable speed. I've tried switching the graphics backends, messing with other settings, and so far nothing's worked, so I'm not sure how they managed to do that. From my experience, 3DS is a bit too much for this device to handle, and anything more modern than the PSP is a no-go. My absolute biggest complaint with this device though is that despite it being sold as this device that's easy to set up and get running right out of the box, I actually found it pretty difficult to access settings within each individual emulator. Sometimes it was easy, like with the PSP where you just press F1 and it pops open the menu allowing you to access save states, customize the video options and more. But then when you go over to Dreamcast, it's just select to open the menu, and then anything that uses RetroArch is select and X. And yeah, while I was testing all of these games, the RetroArch menu interface kinda glitched out and I couldn't get it to go back to normal, so there's that as well. Why couldn't the device have come pre-configured to make it so that all of these quick menu hotkeys were set to the same button? This is a serious hurdle to jump over for anyone getting into the handheld emulator scene, especially with a device like this that's supposed to be easy to play out of the box. Another massive issue is that this doesn't seem to have a sleep option. Like normally you'd press the power button and the screen would turn off, and then pressing it again would wake it up and allow you to continue exactly where you left off. But here, pressing the power button literally doesn't do anything unless you hold it, which ends up completely shutting the device down, with you then needing to fully boot it up from scratch again when you turn it back on. This is a pretty huge issue for a handheld console like this because it basically removes the pick up and play element because you need to wait for so long to turn it back on. This is such a weird little device. On the one hand, I like how it looks and it is actually pretty comfortable to hold despite the fact it's just flat on the back with no grip. The screen is a really good size, which is ideal for playing the sorts of games this can actually run. It has pretty good battery life, with me getting around 6 hours out of it throughout my testing. The sound quality is even pretty decent, although obviously nothing earth-shattering, and the UI for selecting the games is really simple to navigate. But then you have these elements of it where you have to ask what they were thinking. It has no Wi-Fi capabilities, the HDMI output seemingly doesn't work at all, it has a focus on being as easy to navigate and set up as possible, and yet the emulator quick menu hotkeys aren't set up to be consistent across every system, and then potentially, most importantly, it's at a really bad price point, being comparable to other devices with more power, more features, and more of a premium finish. I think what this all comes down to is that the market is far too bloated for a device like this to stand out anymore. At this point, these handhelds either need to have a gimmick with the form factor, or be powerful enough to play GameCube and PS2 games flawlessly out of the box. Anything less than that and they just drift away into the sea of similar handhelds, and the RGB10Max3 Pro is an example of one such device. I just can't recommend it when there's so many other devices that do a similar thing and do it at a much lower price. I mean, for example, I have the Anbernic 353VS, a way older device with worse specs, but it can play everything that the RGB10Max3 Pro can, and it's currently $88 as opposed to $115. You don't stand a chance with PS2 or GameCube on the 353VS, but it's not like you can consistently play them on the RGB10Max3 Pro either. So what's the point in having the better hardware if there's not really any use for it? Then you've got devices like the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus sitting at $149 and the Anbernic RG405V at an even more attractive $138, and both of these feature the much more powerful Unisoc Tiger T618 CPU and even have additional features like Wi-Fi functionality, touchscreens, and in the case of the Pocket 3 Plus, it even has HDMI output and a way higher resolution screen. Even though these options are slightly more expensive, they're not that much more expensive, and you're getting far more bang for your buck with these other options. So me personally, I would probably just save up a bit and get one of those. Also, why do all of these handheld devices have such stupidly convoluted names? I swear there must be some kind of inside joke going on with all of these manufacturers to see who can get away with the most absurd name. I mean, the PowKiddy RGB10Max3 Pro? They've got to be kidding me with that name. But let me know your thoughts. Did you end up picking up one of these? And if so, what have your experiences with it been like so far? For all of the complaining that I've done throughout this video, I did actually enjoy my time with this. It's got a few quirks that probably should have been ironed out, and I would have liked it to have had a bit more power. As always, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe to see more retro content coming soon, and I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.